Everyone had heard the story, the one about Rachel Sizelove, the girl they called crazy until one night, in the middle of a normal gathering, the ceiling above them literally gave way. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically. At first, people dismissed it, said it was exaggerated, misunderstood, impossible. But the people who were there, they tell a different story, a story of hunger, of silence, of a pursuit that refused to stop until something broke through. And what happened that night didn't just shock a room, it started a conversation that hasn't ended since. So what really happened? Was it real, or just another story people wanted to believe? Before we get into it, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let's go back to the beginning. They said Rachel Sizelove was too intense, too emotional, too passionate, too different. In a world that quietly rewards predictability, Rachel stood out in ways that made people uncomfortable. She didn't just believe in God, she expected him to move. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. And that, to most people around her, was the problem. Rachel grew up in what many would call a normal Christian environment. Church on Sundays, occasional midweek services, a belief in miracles, but only the kind that happened in the past. The kind you read about, not the kind you witness. But Rachel couldn't accept that. As a teenager, she would sit in church listening to sermons about healing, power, and revival, and something inside her would burn. Not inspiration, not motivation, a deep, unsettling question. If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, why don't we see what they saw? That question refused to leave her. While others were content with routine religion, Rachel began to hunger for something real. She spent long nights praying, not polished, rehearsed prayers but raw. Honest conversations, sometimes filled with tears, sometimes with frustration. God, if you're real like they say, I want to see it. At first, nothing happened, no visions, no voices, no dramatic encounters, just silence. And silence has a way of testing conviction. Months passed, then years. The fire inside her didn't die, but it did something else. It deepened. What started as curiosity turned into desperation. Rachel began to change. She withdrew from shallow conversations. She lost interest in things that once entertained her. While her peers chased trends, relationships, and social validation, Rachel found herself drawn to prayer meetings, worship sessions, and long hours alone. People noticed, and they didn't understand. Why are you always so serious? You need to relax. You're taking this God thing too far. At first, she tried to explain. She tried to put words to what she felt inside. But how do you explain hunger to someone who has never been truly starving? Eventually, she stopped trying. Instead, she pressed in deeper. There were nights she would lie on the floor, praying until her voice grew hoarse. Days when she fasted, not out of obligation, but out of longing. She wasn't chasing an experience. She was chasing God himself, but from the outside. It didn't look noble. It looked strange. Friends began to distance themselves, some out of confusion, others out of discomfort. Even within church circles, there were whispers. She's becoming extreme. She's unbalanced. She needs to calm down. And then came the word that would follow her for years: crazy. It wasn't always said directly to her face. Sometimes it was behind closed doors. Other times it slipped out in casual conversation. But she heard it, and it hurt, because Rachel wasn't trying to be different. She wasn't trying to stand out. She was simply responding to something she couldn't ignore. A pull, a calling, a knowing that there was more. Still, the tension grew. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes when you're pursuing something others don't understand. It's not just isolation, it's the feeling of being misunderstood at your core. Rachel felt that deeply. There were moments she questioned herself. Am I really going too far? Maybe they're right. Maybe this is all in my head. Doubt crept in, quiet but persistent. But every time she considered pulling back, something inside her resisted, because even in the silence, she knew God was real. She knew he was near. and she knew somehow that what she was seeking was not in vain. So she kept going, even when it made no sense, even when it cost her relationships, even when it labeled her as too much. Then something began to shift. It wasn't dramatic at first. No thunder, no lightning, just small, almost imperceptible changes. Moments during prayer where the atmosphere felt heavier. Times in worship where she sensed a presence she couldn't explain. A growing awareness that she wasn't alone. It was subtle but undeniable. Rachel didn't talk about it much. She had learned that sharing too much only invited more skepticism. So she kept these experiences close, letting them strengthen her quietly. But internally, everything was changing. Her faith was no longer theoretical. It was becoming experiential. And that scared people even more. Because there's something unsettling about someone who believes not casually, but completely. Someone who isn't just hoping, but expecting. Rachel had crossed that line. She no longer prayed if God would move, she prayed when. And that shift, though invisible, set the stage for everything that would follow. What no one around her realized was this: the same intensity they criticized was preparing her. Every long night, every tear, every moment of doubt, she pushed through. It was all building towards something no one could explain, something no one could control, something that would silence every voice that called her crazy. But at this point, Rachel didn't know that. All she knew was that she couldn't go back. Once you've tasted even a glimpse of something real, ordinary life becomes unbearable. So she leaned in further. More prayer, more surrender, more hunger. And with it came a growing tension, like standing on the edge of something unseen, but inevitable. She could feel it. Something was coming. Not because she deserved it, not because she earned it, but because she refused to settle. And the deeper she went, the more the pressure built, until one day, everything would break open. Not gradually, not quietly, but in a way that absolutely no one could ignore. And when it happened, even the ceiling itself would not be able to contain it. But before that moment, the moment people would talk about for years, there was a final stretch, a hidden season where the intensity reached its peak, and Rachel would be pushed to the very edge of everything she believed. There is a moment in every genuine pursuit of God where passion alone is no longer enough. A moment where desire meets resistance, where hunger meets silence, where faith is no longer emotional but costly. Rachel Sizelove had entered that moment. What began as a deep longing had now become a refining fire. The quiet encounters she once experienced, those subtle moments in prayer where God felt near, started to fade. Not completely, but enough to be noticeable. And that change was unsettling, because it's one thing to seek God when you feel Him. It's another thing entirely to keep seeking when you don't. Rachel found herself praying the same prayers, but now they felt like they were hitting the ceiling and falling back down. Worship felt dry. Scripture felt distant. Even the presence she once sensed began to feel withdrawn. And this is where many people stop. This is where people say, maybe this isn't for me. This is where passion calls and life returns to normal. But Rachel didn't stop, even when it stopped making sense. Even when it felt like everything she had built internally was beginning to collapse. She pressed in harder, but the deeper she went, the more intense the pressure became. It wasn't just spiritual anymore, it started affecting every area of her life. Emotionally, she felt stretched. Mentally, she felt exhausted. Socially, she felt completely isolated. The same people who once questioned her now seemed even more distant. "Are you okay?" they would ask, but not out of concern, out of suspicion. "You've changed too much. This isn't healthy. You need balance." That word balance began to sound like compromise to her, because from Rachel's perspective, she wasn't losing balance. She was losing everything else for the sake of something real. But the weight of it was undeniable. There were nights she cried not out of weakness, but out of sheer exhaustion. "God, where are you?" Not a dramatic prayer, not a rehearsed line, just a raw question from someone who refused to pretend. Asterisk, and still, silence. Days turned into weeks, and what made it harder wasn't just the silence, it was the contradiction. Because deep inside, She still believed. She still knew God was real. She still knew He was near. But her experience no longer matched her conviction. And that tension is one of the hardest places to live. It's where faith is no longer supported by feelings. It's where belief stands alone without evidence. Without reinforcement, Rachel was no longer running on passion. She was running on decision. Every day she woke up and chose to continue. Not because it felt good, not because it was rewarding, but because turning back was no longer an option. And something about that kind of pursuit changes you. It strips away performance. It exposes motives. It reveals whether you're seeking God or just the experience of Him. Rachel was being refined. Every hidden expectation, every subconscious desire for recognition, every need for a validation, one by one, they were being burned away, until all that remained was this: even if I feel nothing, I'll still seek you. That kind of surrender is rare, and it doesn't happen publicly. It happens in quiet rooms, in unseen moments, in prayers no one else hears. But while this process was happening internally, something else was happening externally. The pressure was building. Rachel began attending gatherings, small prayer meetings, worship nights, moments where people came together expecting God to move. At first, they looked like every other gathering, simple, ordinary, predictable, but Rachel could feel something others couldn't. A tension in the atmosphere, not negative, just charged, like the air before a storm. She didn't talk about it. She had learned her lesson about sharing too early. But internally, the awareness grew stronger. Something was shifting, not just in her but in the environment around her. During one particular gathering, she found herself completely undone. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden miracle, just worship. But this time, something was different. The same songs, the same voices, the same room, yet the atmosphere felt thick, almost tangible. Rachel dropped to her knees, not out of emotion, but because she physically felt like she couldn't stand. Her heart was racing, her thoughts went quiet, and for the first time in weeks, she felt it again. That presence, not faint, not subtle, but undeniable. Tears began to fall, not from sadness, but from recognition. God, you're here. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And in that moment, everything she had been holding on to internally began to make sense. The silence hadn't been absence, it had been preparation. The dryness hadn't been rejection, it had been refinement. And now, something was about to break open, but not in the way she expected, because what Rachel didn't realize was this: that moment where she felt His presence again wasn't the destination, it was the threshold, the line between hidden pursuit and visible manifestation. From that night forward, things began to accelerate, not gradually, not slowly, but with a kind of intensity that made it impossible to ignore. More gatherings began to carry that same weight. More people started noticing something unusual. Moments of worship began stretching longer because no one wanted to leave. And Rachel, she could feel it building, the pressure, the anticipation, the undeniable sense that something was about to happen. Something beyond emotion, beyond atmosphere, something physical. But with that anticipation came a new kind of tension, because when you sense something coming, but don't know when or how, it creates a kind of holy discomfort. Rachel found herself on edge, not anxious, but aware. Every prayer felt loaded. Every gathering felt significant, and deep inside, there was a quiet knowing, this is it, but it hadn't happened yet. And that waiting, that space between promise and fulfillment, is where everything either falls apart or comes together. Rachel was standing right there, at the edge, and what happened next would not only validate everything she had endured, it would completely redefine what people thought was possible. Because the next moment would not stay hidden in prayer rooms, it would break into the physical world, in a way no one could explain, and no one could deny. The room was full that night, just another gathering, just another time of worship, until suddenly, something shifted in a way that would leave everyone frozen in awe. The room wasn't supposed to be extraordinary. There were no flashing lights, no elaborate stage design, no global names or media coverage, Just a group of people gathered again. Same kind of meeting, same expectation, same simple pursuit. But this night was different. Not visibly at first. The room filled gradually. Conversations were normal. People greeted each other, some quietly finding their seats, others standing in small circles, talking softly. Nothing about the environment suggested that history was about to be made. And yet, there was a weight in the air, subtle but present. Rachel felt it the moment she walked in. Not as a thought, not as emotion, but as a knowing. She couldn't explain it, but everything in her became alert. Her senses sharpened not physically, but spiritually. It was the same awareness she had felt building over the past few weeks, only now it was stronger, heavier, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The worship began as it always did. Soft music, gentle voices, a slow, steady rhythm. People sang but cautiously at first. Some were still distracted, others were settling in. A few checked their phones. It looked like any other gathering, until it didn't. Somewhere between one song and the next, something shifted, not gradually, suddenly. The room grew quiet not because the music stopped, but because something else took over, a presence, tangible, undeniable. It felt like the air thickened. People stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even those who weren't paying attention moments ago suddenly became aware that something was happening. Rachel's heart began to race, not from fear, but from recognition. This is it. She didn't say it out loud, but everything in her knew. The prayers, the silence, the refining. It had all led here. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees, not as a decision, as a response. All around the room, others began to do the same. Some stood frozen, some lifted their hands, some began to weep quietly at first. The music continued, but it no longer felt like the source of what was happening. It had become background to something far greater. The presence intensified. It wasn't emotional hype. There was no crescendo, no manipulation, just weight, a holy, overwhelming awareness that filled every corner of the room. Rachel could barely breathe, not because something was wrong, but because something was too real. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "God," just one word, but it carried everything. And then it happened. At first, it was subtle, a sound, faint, almost unnoticeable, like a crack. Some people didn't hear it, others looked around, confused. Then it came again, louder this time. A distinct, unmistakable sound from above. Crack, heads tilted upward. The music faltered slightly, but didn't stop. And then crack. This time, everyone heard it. The room froze. For a split second, time seemed to pause, and then the ceiling began to shift, not metaphorically, not spiritually, physically. Asterisk panels started to move slowly at first, then more noticeably. Gasps filled the room. Some people stepped back instinctively. Others stood rooted to the spot, unable to move. Rachel didn't move. She couldn't. Her eyes were fixed upward, her entire body trembling, not in fear, but in awe. The ceiling solid, structured, unmoving, was no longer stable. It began to give way. A section of it right above where many were gathered shifted, then separated. And then it opened, not collapsed, not destroyed, opened, like something unseen had pushed through from above. Light spilled in, not artificial, not from fixtures, but something different, brighter, cleaner, unexplainable. The room erupted. Some screamed, some cried out, some fell to the ground. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they were seeing. Because this wasn't something you interpret. This wasn't something you explain away. This was happening, right in front of them. Rachel was overwhelmed, not by what she saw but by what she felt. The presence that had filled the room before was now magnified, intensified beyond anything she had ever experienced. It was no longer just around her. It was everywhere. The weight increased to the point where standing felt impossible. People began falling, not dramatically, not chaotically, but as if something greater had gently taken over. No one was directing it. No one was controlling it. This wasn't organized, this was raw. And in the middle of it all, Rachel understood every moment of doubt, every accusation, every whisper that called her crazy. It all led to this, not to prove her right, but to reveal something greater. God was not limited to concepts, not confined to buildings, not restricted to expectations. And in that moment, even the ceiling could not contain him. The atmosphere became overwhelming. Time lost meaning, minutes felt like hours. Or maybe it was the other way around. No one was checking clocks. No one was thinking about leaving. Because how do you walk away from something like this? Rachel lay on the ground, tears streaming, her heart completely undone. There were no more questions, no more doubts, only one overwhelming reality. He is real, not as belief, not as theology, but as presence. And that presence had just broken through, in a way that no one in that room would ever forget. But as powerful as that moment was, it was only the beginning. Because what happens when something like this occurs? When the unexplainable becomes visible, when the supernatural interrupts the natural, it doesn't stay contained. Word spreads, questions rise, skeptics speak, and suddenly, what was once hidden in a small room becomes a story the world begins to hear. Rachel didn't leave that night as the intense girl anymore. Now, she was something else, something people didn't have a category for, and not everyone would respond the same way. Because when something challenges what people believe is possible, it forces a decision to believe, to question, or to reject. And what came next would test not just Rachel, but everyone who heard the story. By morning, the whispers had already begun. What happened in that room was no longer just an experience. It had become a controversy. By morning, everything had changed. What happened in that room didn't stay in that room. It couldn't. Not because people were trying to promote it, but because something that's undeniable refuses to remain hidden. The moment people stepped out, phones came out, messages were sent, voices carried urgency. Something happened last night. You won't believe this. The ceiling literally opened. At first, it sounded like exaggeration, then like confusion, then like something people couldn't quite articulate. But one thing was clear. Everyone who was there knew, and everyone who wasn't wanted to know. Within hours, the story began to spread, not in a controlled, organized way but organically. Conversations in homes, voice notes in group chats, posts that were vague enough to stir curiosity, but strong enough to spark debate. And as expected, reactions divided quickly. Some were in awe. They spoke with trembling voices, still trying to process what they had seen. For them, the experience didn't need explanation. It was self-evident. You could feel it. It wasn't normal. There's no way to describe it. Others were intrigued but cautious. They leaned in, asking questions. What exactly happened? Was it structural damage? Did anyone record it? They weren't rejecting the story, but they weren't ready to accept it fully either. And then there were the skeptics, not curious, not open, but dismissive. That's impossible. It must have been staged. People exaggerate things like this all the time. The same word that had followed Rachel 4 years began to resurface. But now, louder, crazy, only this time, it wasn't just directed at her. It extended to everyone who was there. Because when something challenges people's understanding of reality, the easiest response is not to investigate, but to reject. Rachel watched all of this unfold in real time. The messages, the questions, the doubt. And for a brief moment, she felt the weight of it. Because it's one thing to experience something deeply personal, it's another thing to watch that experience be dissected, debated, and dismissed by people who weren't there. She could feel the tension rising again. Not internally this time, but externally. Voices speaking, opinions forming, narratives shifting. And in the middle of it all, one silent question lingered. What do you do when the unexplainable becomes public? Rachel didn't rush to respond. She didn't jump online to defend the moment. She didn't try to convince anyone. She didn't gather evidence or build arguments. Because deep down, she understood something most people didn't. What happened that night was never meant to be proven. It was meant to be experienced. And no explanation, no matter how detailed, could ever recreate what was felt in that room. Still, the pressure continued to build. People began reaching out to her directly, some with genuine curiosity. "Rachel, what really happened? Can you explain it? What did you feel?" Others with underlying skepticism. "Are you sure it wasn't just emotional? Could it have been something natural? Do you think people might have misunderstood?" And then there were those who didn't ask questions at all. They made statements. "This is why people don't take things seriously. This is dangerous. This is how deception spreads." Rachel read those words, and for a moment, the old voices echoed again. The same ones from years ago. "You're too much. You've gone too far. This isn't normal." But this time, something was different, because now, she wasn't standing on belief alone. She had seen it, felt it, lived it, and no external voice, no matter how loud, could override what she knew internally. So instead of reacting, she remained still, not passive, not withdrawn, but grounded. Because what had happened was not fragile. It didn't need protection. Truth doesn't panic under pressure. But as the conversations grew louder, something unexpected began to happen. People who weren't even in the room started experiencing something. Not the same event, not the same manifestation, but something connected. Testimonies began to surface. Quiet at first, then more frequently. I don't know why, but after hearing about it, I started praying differently. Something shifted in me. I felt something I've never felt before. It didn't make headlines. It didn't trend, but it spread, not as a spectacle, but as a ripple. And that ripple was more powerful than the moment itself, because it proved something important. What happened that night wasn't confined to a location. It was a signal, a reminder, an awakening, and suddenly, the conversation began to shift. Not completely. There were still skeptics, still critics, still voices trying to explain it away. But alongside them, there were seekers. People who weren't arguing, people who weren't dismissing, people who were asking one simple question. What if it's real? And that question is where everything begins. Rachel saw it happening, not in crowds, not in platforms, but in individuals. Hearts awakening, hunger rising, curiosity turning into pursuit. And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. The ceiling didn't open to prove a point. It opened to reveal a possibility. That God is not distant, not silent, not limited. And if he could break through in that room, what else could he do? But with that realization came something deeper, responsibility. Because moments like that don't just inspire, they invite. They call people out of comfort, out of routine, out of safe, predictable faith, and into something real. Rachel knew her life would never return to what it was, not because of attention, not because of recognition, but because once you witness something like that, you can't pretend it didn't happen. And the question is no longer, is this real? The question becomes, what do I do with it? As the noise settled and the conversations continued, one thing became clear. What began as a single moment was now becoming a movement, and Rachel was right at the center of it. The noise didn't disappear. It just changed. What started as shock turned into conversation. What began as controversy slowly evolved into curiosity. And what once sounded like an unbelievable story became a question people could no longer ignore. What if this is real? Rachel Sizelove found herself standing in the middle of something she'd never planned for. She never set out to lead anything, never tried to build a platform, never asked for attention. All she wanted was God. And yet, somehow, that quiet pursuit had placed her at the center of a growing movement. But here's what most people didn't see. The real story didn't start when the ceiling opened. It started long before, in the hidden place, in the silence, in the moments no one applauded. And now, the very thing people once criticized had become the thing they were drawn to. Messages kept coming. Not debates this time, not arguments, but hunger. Rachel, how do I experience what you experienced? What did you do differently? Where do I even start? And that question is where everything shifted. Because people were no longer focused on the event. They were searching for the source. And Rachel understood something critical. You can't teach people how to recreate a moment, but you can show them how to pursue the one behind it. So she didn't build a formula. She didn't create steps or strategies. She simply pointed people back to what had always been there. Hunger, surrender, consistency, not glamorous, not complicated, but real. She began gathering small groups not to replicate what happened, but to return to the foundation that led there. Prayer, worship, honest pursuit, and something remarkable began to unfold. Not in the same dramatic way as before. No ceilings opening, no visible manifestations like that night, but something deeper. Lives began to change. People who had only known routine religion began encountering something personal. Faith that once felt distant became tangible. Prayer that once felt empty became alive. It wasn't loud, it wasn't viral, but it was real. And that's what made it powerful, because the greatest impact of that night was never the spectacle. It was the awakening that followed. Rachel watched it happen over and over again. People stepping into a deeper place, letting go of surface-level belief, choosing pursuit over comfort. And in those moments, she saw it clearly. The ceiling didn't open to impress people. It opened to invite them, to step beyond limitation, beyond expectation, beyond the version of faith they had settled for. But with that invitation came a challenge, because not everyone who hears the call responds to it. Some admire it from a distance, some talk about it, some debate it, but only a few actually pursue it. And Rachel never tried to convince anyone. She never forced the narrative, because she understood something deeply. Real hunger cannot be manufactured. It either exists or it doesn't. And for those who felt it, truly felt it, nothing could stop them. Not doubt, not fear, not even the opinions of others. Because once you realize that more is possible, you can't unknow it. And that realization spreads quietly, from person to person, from heart to heart, not as pressure, but as invitation. Months passed. The intensity of the original moment didn't fade, but it matured. It shifted from an event to a lifestyle, from a breakthrough to a foundation. And Rachel remained the same, not elevated, not transformed into something unreachable, just grounded, because the goal was never the moment. It was always the relationship. And that's what she protected. While others tried to define what happened, she stayed focused on why it happened, not to create a movement around her, but to point back to him. And in doing so, she avoided something that often follows moments like this: distraction. Because it's easy to become consumed with the experience, to chase the next moment, the next sign, the next manifestation. But Rachel didn't do that. She returned again and again to the quiet place, the same place where it all began, because she knew, if you lose the foundation, you lose everything. And slowly, the narrative began to settle. Not completely. There would always be questions, always be skeptics. But for those who experienced the ripple effect, there was no going back. And that's where the real story lives. Not in the headlines, not in the debates, but in the lives quietly transformed afterward. So what really happened that night? Was it a miracle? Was it unexplainable? Was it something science could one day define? Maybe. But those questions, while interesting, miss the point. Because the greater question is this: what happens when you realize God is not as distant as you thought? What happens when faith moves from theory to reality? What happens when the ceiling you've placed on what's possible suddenly disappears? For Rachel, the answer was simple: you keep going, not chasing moments, but pursuing Him deeper, further, without limits. And for everyone watching, listening, wondering, the story doesn't end with her. It starts with a decision to stay comfortable, or to become curious, to dismiss, or to explore, to remain where you are, or to step into something more. Because if there's one thing that night proved, it's that the boundaries people believe in are not always real, and sometimes all it takes is one moment, one encounter, one undeniable experience to realize that everything you thought was impossible might just be waiting on the other side of your hunger. If this story challenged you even a little, don't just scroll past it. Take a moment. Ask yourself the real question. What if there's more? And if you've ever experienced something you couldn't explain, something that changed you, I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the stories that sound the craziest are the ones that change everything.